Good afternoon and welcome to our part 4 of our 4-part series on artificial intelligence and how to be successful with your AI programs and initiatives. Before we get started today, I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping. So this is being recorded. We have the other 3 parts if you've missed any of them on the website, so you can certainly download those and listen to them at your leisure. We're going to go for about 30 minutes today or so. We'll try to keep within that time allocation and have some time for questions and answers, and you can use your Q&A tab to submit questions. And we really do appreciate your feedback, so please respond to the survey when you're finished with the webinar. Today we have Cal back. Last week we didn't have Cal, but Cal, do you want to give a quick thumbnail of your background, Cal?
Yeah, hi everyone, good to be back. My name is Cal Dubabe. I'm the managing partner at Pandata. We help organizations get started with AI initiatives. And I'm personally passionate about building AI systems for humans that are ethical and approachable.
Terrific. And I'm still Seth Early, and I'm still founder and CEO of Early Information Science. We've been around for over 25 years, and we help organizations with information architecture, information strategy and across multiple industries, and we help organizations really build the systems and processes that they need to have in place to be successful with AI initiatives. And I just published my book. My book was released yesterday, so please feel free to purchase that and leave a review on Amazon. So I'm very excited to have that out. So first thing we wanted to talk about is the fact that it's really important to go from where organizations are in their AI initiatives around lots of disjointed efforts and POCs and experimentation to really get to the level of scaling and deployment and operationalization. And this figure came from a survey of business leaders that Accenture had done, and this was from an article in Harvard Business Review. I talked about how 75% of the leaders that were interviewed for this study felt that they could be out of business, or would be out of business in 5 years if they can't figure out how to scale AI. That's pretty interesting. So what holds organizations back? What do you really need to do in order to scale your AI initiatives? And of course, if you haven't started, you need to start building these capabilities. And if you are on the path, you need to bring them to the next level. And so there's lots of ways to think about going from things like pilots, POCs and pilots and full deployment. And we're going to talk about that today and talk about ways that you can help your organization build those capabilities, build centers of excellence, and really deploy your capabilities and operationalize them rather than just having lots of disjointed experiments. So today we want to talk about how to prioritize efforts, right? There's a lot of experimentation that's going on, and we need to think about how to deploy these initiatives in a way that balances the ability to get these to market quickly, to get them out into the field, get them in operational without increasing technical debt. And this is where there's a lot of challenges, because organizations can sometimes cut some corners or not necessarily do all of the work that needs to be done to ensure the long-term viability of these applications when they're not well documented, or we don't have the right infrastructure or the right processes. So we really need to think about how to do this without increasing our technical debt. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And then it's really about installing measurements of not only the impact, the business impact, but the progress and how we monitor that progress on an ongoing basis. And really thinking about how to build that into your decision-making and build that into your governance initiatives. We're going to start off with a little bit of a poll. Whoops, what happened here? Oh, okay, we had a little animation issue here. Are you conducting AI pilots or POCs? So what are you doing right now? Do you have POCs or pilots? You might say, well, what's the difference? Or you may say we have lots of POCs, but we don't have a lot of pilots. We have a mix of POCs and pilots, and if you don't know the difference, that's okay. That's a reasonable choice. Maybe you have some POCs, but you have more production deployments. So go ahead and choose what is most appropriate. And we'll give that a little bit of time, and we'll come back to those results in a little bit. But again, where are you in your initiatives? Are you mostly doing POCs? Are you doing pilots? And again, are you in full production? So go ahead and answer that, and we'll come back to that in a little bit. So the first thing we want to talk about when you're building out these initiatives and these programs, you need to think about how to prioritize these initiatives, these capabilities. So when you're building a capability, many times you need other projects, other programs in order to build the foundation. You need precursors, right? There's certain things that need to be in place in order for you to fully deploy your initiative. And many times in these programs, we have they're part of digital transformations. There's lots of different activities. There's lots of different processes that are impacted in the organization. And there's lots of different gap closing activities that we need to engage in. So the question becomes, how do you prioritize those? How do you decide what is most important, and how do you decide when to focus on the precursor, which requires greater levels of investment, versus trying to get something out into the marketplace, right? We have to balance the work that has to be done to, say, fix data quality or fix a supporting process with the ability to learn and to get something out and to do some experimentation. So typically when you do any kind of a roadmap, you say, well, where are we today and where do we need to be, right? What's our target? What are our target capabilities that we have to have in place? We'll go through an example of this shortly. And then there's lots of gaps, right? There's lots of things that have to happen to get you from here to there. When you're building a roadmap, there's multiple work streams, there are multiple initiatives. Many times those are distributed across the organization or across different working groups and different departments or functions. And when we're executing, we have to prioritize. We have to say, well, what are we going to do first, right? And then what are we going to do after that? And sometimes those things that you have to do first are not necessarily going to show a lot of ROI. So part of this is really determining what things have to be done in order for you to be fully operational. And when you look at this, this happens to be a model around orchestration and personalization. And there are lots of different elements. We need to have capabilities in multiple areas. This is something I talk about a lot in the book, but suffice it to say that on the left side, you have maturity models that are in different areas. The product information, for example, customer data, content processes, knowledge processes. In order for us to be able to orchestrate all of those pieces and to say provide personalization, we have to have those supporting processes at a level of maturity that will sustain a deployment. So we can't try to do something that's very advanced in terms of personalization or content choreography or contextualized customer experience if our supporting processes are immature. You can't be at stage 5 with orchestration, but be at stage 1 with content and product data, for example. So a lot of times what this means is that we have dependencies. We have to start off with, okay, what has to be in place in order for us to build this capability? So what we need to understand is, are there critical dependencies? And if we don't go through those foundational projects, what is that going to mean to a deployment? So we can cobble something together. We can hand curate our data and our content. But then what's that going to mean for full deployment? That's going to increase our technical debt. So in other words, by not having, say, the data architecture or the data harmonized, the models harmonized, if you don't have those foundational pieces, Does that mean you can't deploy something? No, it doesn't necessarily mean that, but it's going to be more difficult. It's going to be more costly in the long term, and you're going to be incurring technical debt. You're going to be doing things in a way that will not be as adaptable down the road. And that's okay if you make that decision intentionally. So if this is an example of a digital transformation, and within that digital transformation, there's a few different capabilities around, demand forecasting, for example, and personalized experience, and maybe there's configure price quote. And in each of these, we have certain projects that have to be deployed in order for us to build these other capabilities. So what are the factors? And we want to prioritize and say, what are we going to do first? We need to think through what those factors are. Are there dependencies? Are there is there a large amount of complexity? Is it going to be costly? Do we have a clear, measurable business case? Do we have an easy to measure ROI? Are there compliance issues? Is it revenue generating? Do we have multiple audiences? How sustainable is it? So again, these are just example factors. And in your organization, what you're going to do is determine what is important for you. So here's an example of a prioritization matrix. And essentially what we want to do is say, how are we going to prioritize? Are we looking at this according to a capability? Are we looking at this according to a process? It could be around a body of content or repository. It could be around a particular problem or challenge. So again, whatever it is, you're saying, if we're going to tackle this capability, if we're going to tackle this data source, if we're going to tackle this problem, whatever it is, we need to prioritize that. So we need to say, okay, what are the things we're going to be comparing or prioritizing against, right? So we're going to say it's project 1 versus project 5. Or is it capability, or is it a data source or a problem? What is it that we're looking at? And then we need to say, okay, how are we evaluating this, right? So in some cases, you might say, well, I want to do something that's going to support a large number of processes, right? I want to be able to say, I'm going to support multiple processes. And again, for example, for an infrastructure project, you might say, yeah, this is going to be important because we need to support all of these other initiatives that are going on. So perhaps if I'm going to support a large number of processes, I'm going to give it a higher weighting or a higher score. I could say, well, I want something that's going to be enterprise-wide versus departmental because it's going to be easier to justify. It'll have a greater impact. And so I'm going to weight it with a higher weighting if it's enterprise-wide. Same thing with ROI. Do we have a clear ROI? If we do, I'm going to give it a higher score. How difficult is it? How measurable? How complex, and so on. So all of these criteria will be scored and weighted according to what's important. You may say, well, you know what? I actually want to do this in a small scale. I want to do this as a POC. So the scoring would be different, right? We would say, well, it really needs to be departmental. And we're going to talk about doing a POC versus a pilot shortly. And again, we want to look at those weighted element scores. So for each one of these, we are putting a score together, and then we are totaling the scores. So this is how we start thinking about this. And it's not necessarily the process of getting the score, it's the process of starting the conversation. It's the process of determining what those factors are. It's the process of getting people engaged in that collaboration and that discussion around what's important to the organization and how you want to think about these things. So that's what this is. You might look at these scores and say, no, I really want to do this. Well, that's okay, right? So let's look at this from the perspective. So that's an overall prioritization. Oh, and by the way, we do have some scores. So we have lots of POCs. It looks like most people have lots of POCs, but few pilot deployments. And some people have nothing in flight. There's a few that are saying, well, what's the difference? And that's what we're going to talk about here. Great. So that's very helpful. So let's continue and talk about pilots versus POC. And when you think about a pilot, and this is one of the points that came across in this article in Harvard Business Review, and it was based on the Accenture study. And what they said is, look, we're going to have a radical recommendation here. Skip POCs, go right to pilots. Okay, that's interesting. Well, what does that really mean? And what we want to put forth here is that when you think about a POC is meant to learn. It's meant to learn and discover and understand things. It's to demonstrate a technology. It's to demonstrate, a capability, but in a short time frame, and so that you can learn what needs to be done. A pilot is to scale. So we want to validate our initiatives in the real world, but on a smaller scale to prove value, but with the consideration of what it's going to take to actually do it. So again, a POC is more about a throwaway. A POC is lower cost, it's lower effort, it's more about learning. And a pilot is really about what are we going to do to really make this deploy and scale. And so part of this is about the project, right, itself, the product characteristics. Part of it is about the organizational maturity. As we talked about with those maturity models, we need to think, well, do I have the capability, do I have the maturity in the supporting process to really scale this thing? And if you don't, well, maybe you're better off doing a POC, learning about what supporting processes need to be in place, and then justifying those investments, right? So it's about thinking about the supporting structures and the infrastructure and the supporting processes. So when you start looking at this, and Cal, I know you did a little bit of research on this. Why don't I let you walk through some of these points around the POC versus the pilot?
Yeah, thank you, Seth. So, at a high level, something that we wanted everyone to take away from this is it's less about whether you should choose a pilot or a POC because of the result of either, but more about are you ready to jump into a pilot, or do you really need to start with a POC first? And so we try to come up with a few different points that can help you self-assess. One of the biggest is there high risk of failure or harm, right? Does the technology that you're testing potentially have an adverse effect on customer experience or end users of the solution in mind? Do you have a lot of unknowns? And it's not necessarily a negative thing, to know that you have risks, but if you don't even know what those risks are, that's where you really want to start thinking about proving out and demonstrating some capabilities first. Next, this also applies to data quality. Again, there's no such thing as a perfect data set, and if you keep trying to perfect your data set, you're never going to get to a proof of concept or pilot. And so it's more important to really understand, and know what the flaws are in the data so that you can start working around them. And finally, proofs of concept are really appropriate if, one, you have a limited budget, or two, you have a shorter time frame where you need to demonstrate results. When you're piloting a solution, you're talking about taking something and putting it into the real world. It's not just a more expensive process, but you actually need to have personnel capacity to make sure it's a success, because there's a lot of different processes that'll depend on integrating it into the way that you do things. And typically what you want to see when you're jumping into a pilot is the willingness to accept a longer time frame to gather real world feedback.
Thank you, Cal. So let's talk about the same matrix, the same prioritization matrix, but this is really determining whether we're going to do this as a pilot or a POC. And the same idea applies. What are the factors? What do you need to think about? Is it a proven technology or is it an unproven technology? Well, if you want to do this as a pilot, and again, a high score is going to tend to push you in the direction of a pilot. A low score will be a POC. So if you have unknown and or unproven technology, if you're going to likely do it as a POC. Same thing with data quality. If you don't know your data quality issues, you're probably going to want to do a POC to identify those. How much experience is there? If there's not a lot of experience, you're going to want to do a POC. Customer risk, if there's high levels of customer risk, and so on. You can, is the ROI proven? Are the legal and compliance risks low? Do you have a good amount of buy-in? Do you have the budget? Do you have, the sustainability? Is there a great impact to the customer? And there's more, right? But the idea here is you're trying to be very clear about what you're capable of and what is practical given these constraints, right? So don't jump into a pilot if you don't if you don't understand the technology and you don't know what your data quality is and you don't have a clear ROI and so on, right? So this just makes it very clear how to do this. Now, we talked a little bit about technical debt. Sometimes people call it code debt. Sometimes people talk tech debt. It's really when we take shortcuts, whether they're intentional or unintentional. It's better to be intentional, obviously. It accumulates over time. It slows you down. It impacts the ability to adapt and change. There can be unintended consequences from this. It's hard to leverage lessons learned when we are not documenting things well. And it becomes a way to kind of do things, right? People say, yeah, well, we don't document things, and this compounds that debt, right? Whenever you're talking about, there's no free lunch. So when you're incurring technical debt, there is a cost. And so, you may decide to incur that cost, but be intentional about it. And where does technical debt come from? Many times if we try to do configurations that are hard-coded or integrations that are hard-coded to get it out, to be faster, to get it to market, right? A lot of times that happens. And I saw that with a recent customer that was doing search applications. And what started out as one little hard-coded item became hundreds and thousands of hard-coded items over time. That is a dangerous precedent to set. So think about it. When you're making those changes or when you're making those decisions, think about what the ramifications are. A lot of times it's from not necessarily thinking through the requirements appropriately. Well, we'll skip that part. We'll do it later, right? Not getting detailed use cases, building these as standalone solutions that are not going to be integrated, not thinking about the downstream impact, not having maintenance budgets, not being able to be intentional about the change management, right? Oh, I had somebody once say for an e-commerce product, oh, it's just a drop down. We can put anything in there and change it later. No, don't do that, right? You really need to be intentional about this stuff, or not being able to leverage your lessons learned. People are doing these things in other areas. They're solving problems, but if they're not capturing, documenting, and sharing that, or documenting in a shareable way, that's going to lead to problems down the road. You're going to be repeating the same mistakes, or you're going to be incurring the same costs over and over again. So again, this keeps us from building maturity. This is where you have those supporting processes and the infrastructure that is not scalable or adaptable or flexible. And so those maturity models you looked at before, that's low maturity is equal to high technical debt. And that's the problem, right? So let's talk about how we want to think about doing these things in a way that is measurable. And again, you may have to push off your deployments in some ways. You may have to make greater investments. But what's important here is to measure not just the business impact, but the progress. So if you say, well, we have to make all this investment in data, well, wait a minute, that can be a black hole. Well, how do I know we're making progress? So this is where we want to think about both the metrics, which is around, they're quantifiable, but they're not necessarily results. They're not necessarily related to business results or business impact, right? So data quality directly will not necessarily lead to business impact. We have to have some linkage. A KPI is really the business value. It's really saying, well, what do we have? What are we getting for the business? What outcome? What impact? And how do we leverage that in terms of getting new insights and so on. So when we start thinking about the decision making, it's doing some kind of, and this happened to be for website usability, but it's coming up with a hypothesis, right? This is understanding those users, this is understanding their objectives, collecting the data on whatever it is that they're doing, and then trying to identify the issues when you have a corrective action or an intervention, measuring again, right? So you're doing this as in a cyclical way. You have a hypothesis. This is what they're coming for. This is why they're doing things. Let's get the baseline. Let's identify issues. through the data, and then let's have a corrective action and measure again. And many of you have seen this slide before, so I won't go into it in great detail. But the point here is that we can measure at a level that is about business impact, and we can measure a level that is about the progress on the goal. So these lower levels here, so we want to have that linkage, but the metrics, they're all metrics, but there's a difference between KPIs, right? KPIs are about business impact. Metrics are really about the progress and the things that are necessary and that we can use to measure our progress, but are not necessarily going to lead to business outcomes, but they support business outcomes. So the KPIs are about the business outcomes. The metrics are about the things that go into the business outcomes. With this, I want to turn this back over to Cal to talk a little bit about some of the metrics that you'll hear about with regard to AI projects. So Cal, why don't you go ahead and take this over? It looks like we are going to go a little over time here. I apologize, but let's try to go through these pieces reasonably quickly, but there's a lot of complexity here. So Cal?
Sure. So thank you, Seth. And, of course, we'd be remiss in talking about metrics if we didn't have at least a brief introduction to some of the terms that you might hear from vendors that describe the performance of various different AI systems. And for the purpose of the example, we're going to talk about a toy use case here where we're trying to use AI to predict and qualify potential leads to try to determine whether or not they will ultimately become customers or not. So, let's just imagine for a minute here that we have some CRM records. We can clearly identify leads that ultimately became wins and leads that ultimately became losses and distinguish them as such in the CRM. So when we talk about using AI in practice, the AI is never going to be 100% accurate. What it's going to do is it's going to try its best to predict which prospects are likely to become wins, and it's going to be, if it does its job well, right most of the time. And it's also, so just to define some of these terms here, when the AI thinks that it's likely to be a win, and it is in fact true, this is what you might hear as a true positive. Now, when the AI thinks it's going to be a win, but it actually turned out that that lead what became a loss ultimately, that is an incorrect prediction of a win, also known as a false positive. Now, on the other hand, when the AI predicts that prospects are not likely to buy, when it is correct about its negative prediction, so it says, I don't think that they're going to become customers, that is a true negative. And when it is correct, when it's incorrect about that, or alternatively, it missed a prospect that ultimately became a customer, that is called a false negative. And of course, because data scientists like to confuse folks, we have a handy tool here called a confusion matrix. But this is actually a really nifty way of organizing that information. So first of all, I'm going to draw your attention to the rows. That's the ground truth, the actual result. And if you look at the top row, that's counting every time a customer or a lead ultimately became a customer, regardless of whether or not the AI predicted it. And on the bottom, the losses, that is counting all of the leads that were confirmed losses that never became customers, regardless of whether or not the AI caught it. And then if you were to look along the columns, in the column on the left, that is every time the AI thought that a lead was going to become a win, regardless of whether or not that was true. And everything on the right is every time the AI thought that the lead was not going to become a win, regardless of whether or not that is true. And I go through this because you're going to hear two key terms that vendors use a lot to describe the performance of the AI. The first is precision. This is saying what % of time when the AI predicts that it is going to be a win, that it actually is a win. You can think of this in business terms as whenever you have a prediction from the AI, if the precision is high, you can pretty much trust or have high confidence that the model is correct about that prediction. The second metric that you might hear about is recall. And so what this looks at is, of all potential wins, how many of them did the AI catch? And generally speaking, or in many cases, precision and recall tend to come at the expense of one another. And it's going to be really important when you evaluate vendors to understand how that's going to impact the business outcomes that you are ultimately going towards. Do you care more about catching the most cases possible, or do you care more about when the AI catches something that you can trust it?
And just to add a point, many of you may have heard of recall and precision used in a search context, right? When we are searching something, we want to have good recall. We want to be able to get all the results that we can back, or the appropriate. And then the precision is, are they appropriate results, right? What's the precision? I can get 100 documents, but out of 1,000 or 100 documents are returned. But if only 10 of them are appropriate, then that recall may be okay, but the precision is bad, right? So, or I could say, well, I want to have good precision. I want to get exactly the documents I want, but I may miss some. So the precision might be good, but we miss a lot of the ones that are appropriate, and so our recall would not be good. It is possible under certain circumstances to impact both recall and precision, as Cal is saying. They're usually inversely proportional. But there are ways to make them more precise. But you may hear that from a search perspective, and you may hear it from some of these other algorithms. But search, of course, is a machine learning algorithm in its own right. So that's where that comes in. Should I move to the next slide?
Yes, please. I want to end with a story.
Whoops, I'm sorry about. Okay, there we go. Great.
No worries. So, I wanted to share a real story, or come back to a story that we shared early on in this series, where we had an AI project that actually moved from proof of concept to pilot and had unintended consequences. So just to give you a little bit of the premise, we were working with a sales team that was trying to qualify some leads to identify potential premium tier members from a list that was provided by advertising partners. They were trying to rely on AI to uncover more potential members that they might not have been catching. And so when we did the proof of concept and we looked at the trained AI system, it demonstrated that it could increase membership by over 30%. This corresponds to the true positive bucket. We thought that we could increase that by 30%, but when we actually came time to roll this out into the real world and we started our pilot, fewer than 2% of these prospect leads ultimately converted versus their typical 10%. So what went wrong? Was it the AI or was it the humans? And as it turns out, it was a combination of factors. Fundamentally, the sales team wasn't even reaching out to these pilot leads as consistently as they were their traditional sources. And there were a few things that went wrong here. First, the model was behaving as expected and identifying leads that looked different from the ones that they were experienced with. Second, it was also providing these leads without context. It wasn't explaining why it thought that that was likely to become a customer. And finally, the team itself, their incentives depended on their closes. And so they were incentivized to go with the leads that they trusted. And one final subnote here is to compound all of this, some of the new leads that the system was looking at came from new geographic regions. And this model happened to be highly tuned to locales where county information was really valuable. And so trying to get this model or AI system to operate on circumstances it hadn't seen before was actually limiting some of the performance. And so what does this mean to you? When you start to pilot AI solutions, inevitably you're going to encounter some of these challenges, and it's really important to understand what's contributing to the performance. Just as Seth was talking about the ultimate top line, right? You can think of this process ultimately manifesting itself in terms of how many leads are actually closing. But if you dig under the hood a little bit, the team was not actually even qualifying these leads at the same rate. And that really led us to uncover some usability challenges with the AI system. And then finally, when looking at the data, we noticed the substantial increase in new geographic regions. And so you're going to want to use this framework to start thinking about what you need to fix when you start to pilot your new AI solution. Is it the process? Is it the usability of the system? Or is it the underlying data?
Yeah, that's great. And I think it's really important to realize that many times you have conflated factors. So breaking them up into looking at these different pieces, and you can have measures on all of these. We want to tie up right now and really think about, how do you get a momentum and get buy-in and maintain the buy-in on these programs and these projects and these investments. And again, starting out with business case and establishing the baseline. That's really what it's about. I mean, it's measurement. What are our outcomes? What do we expect those outcomes? The prioritization matrices get the conversation started, right? That's where we want to start thinking about focusing efforts. You want to get that discussion going. You want to get people engaged and understanding what those factors are. So when you go through that decision-making, that prioritization, it really just gets the conversation started. Want to take those objectives and align them with the business imperatives. We want to align them with the departmental metrics, right? So again, it's saying, okay, here's the big outcome, here's what we're measuring, here's what we're predicting, this is what's important to you. And then making sure those stakeholders understand how what's important to them is going to be measured. And the scorecards and the dashboards need to be in place to course correct, to decide on those interventions, and to show progress. So if there's anything you want you to take away from this, it's again, understanding the priorities, it's understanding the precursors, what needs to be in place, and it's monitoring and measuring as you go. And that's really the key set of takeaways around this. There's a lot of new articles that came out. Actually had one in Harvard Business Review yesterday. We should have that up here, but we'll send that all out to you. There's a few things that came out in the last few days along with the book launch. And right now, we still have a few minutes to get some questions. So let's see what we have here. Give me 1 second. All right. So, let's see. So one of the questions that I see is, so this would be for Cal. So Cal, when you are looking at recall and precision, how do you go about comparing different algorithms or different vendor offerings from that perspective? What's the mechanism for establishing that? Can you do an apples to apples comparison between, say, two different vendors that are proposing a solution? How would you do that?
Sure. So Seth, if you could scroll back to slide 27 or the one with the matrix, you may not hear, you might hear just on the website that they're saying something like we're X% accurate or we're highly accurate. These are the kinds of questions that you need to probe for with vendors to really understand the strength of their solution. And so when it comes down to whether or not precision or recall is more important to you, I'm going to flip it back to this matrix. This is a really good way to organize your thinking around it. You have the top left corner and the bottom right corner that are performing as expected. The model predicting a win when it's actually a win, the model predicting a loss when it's actually a loss. Those are good, and you want those numbers to be as large as possible. Now, when you choose between recall and precision, you need to ask yourself, what creates more harm or introduces more risk? Predicting something as a win and reaching out and having them not convert ultimately. Are you annoying your customers by reaching out unnecessarily? Or is it more harmful to the business when you are missing many of the otherwise could be wins? And so it's important to ask yourself which is more costly, which is more risky, and this is going to depend on your unique situation.
Great, thank you. And here's another question. It seems like most of the AI that we're discussing is around bots and data analytics. Have we engaged in computer vision, deep learning, or I guess image recognition for medical? I personally have not. We have, we focus a lot on the information architecture around analytics and cognitive systems. And the work that we've done with imaging has always been around what to do with the images. So to me, those types of algorithms, that's, a lot of heavy lifting, and there's a lot of stuff out there. So we don't do, say, research in computer vision, algorithms, but there's a lot of great stuff out there. Our focus is, okay, what do you do with the results of those algorithms? So the example I like to use is manufacturing defects. You can have computer vision algorithms that will identify parts that are defective, but then how do you contextualize those results? So our piece is more around the knowledge architecture as opposed to those images themselves. Cal, do you have some experience? Can you speak to any of the image computer vision and
Yeah, so we've had a few small opportunities where we've worked on some image recognition, but what we see a lot in the market is a lot of AI applications around natural language, whether it's classification or in some cases chatbots, or applying deep learning systems to do some of the forecasting. In fact, the sales example that I gave was based off of a deep learning model.
Great. We're right about at a quarter of the hour, so that is really the time that we have today. If there's any additional questions people might have, feel free to reach out and connect with us. Let me go ahead and put our contact information up again. I wanted to thank Sharon and Cal for putting this series together. Thanks to everyone for attending. Please feel free to reach out and connect on LinkedIn. Follow us at Early Information Science, and of course, buy my book. All right, and feel free to call or send an email if you have any questions or any initiatives that you'd like to get input on, and we'd be happy to chat with you. So thank you for your time today, and thank you for your efforts, and we will talk on a future webinar. We have one on May 12th. We're going to be participating with Tom Davenport and Josh Bernoff, and we're going to be talking about Tom's book, which is the AI Advantage, and the takeaways from his book, as well as the takeaways from my book. And so that will be facilitated by Josh Bernoff. So if you can make it on May 12th, we'll send that information out for you, and perhaps we'll see you then. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.